Welcome to episode 319 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak encouragement into the hearts of educators and get you informed and energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm talking with Trevor Muir about how to teach creatively despite constraints. Visit truthforteachers.com for an easy-to-read, easy-to-share version of this podcast episode. If you're listening to this episode because you need a little dose of encouragement, make sure you're on my email list. I send one message per week on Sunday evenings to help take away the Sunday scaries and give you something useful and positive to focus on. Each email I send is personally written by me and is a message from the heart. And it's typically different from what I release on the podcast that week, rather than a duplicate. So if you'd like to have an encouraging, positive message from me at the start of your work week, just go to truthforteachers.com and sign up at the box at the very top of the page. My guest today is Trevor Muir. He's a teacher, author, creator, and co-founder of the New Teacher Academy. His books have helped teachers worldwide to create purposeful and dynamic learning experiences. Trevor has taught in middle school, high school, and college classrooms, as well as pre-service teachers at Grand Valley State University. Trevor has a deep passion for teaching creatively, so I invited him on the show to address a question that has been submitted to me a number of times from folks who listen to the show. And that is, how do I hold on to my creativity as a teacher when the profession is increasingly being standardized? Listen in as we discuss what creativity looks like even within systems that aren't designed to foster creativity. Trevor, creativity often feels like a luxury in education when teachers face so many demands. How do you define creative teaching, and why do you think it's so essential even when there's so many constraints?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. The way I think about creativity in teaching is just it's facing the reality that kids are all individuals. They're unique. And so this idea that you would teach them all the same, or that like the one way you teach one student is going to meet the needs of all of your other students. It's like that's asinine, right? Like that doesn't really make sense when you know what people are like and what kids are like. And so I think creativity in teaching is figuring out how do I creatively adapt what I'm teaching and how I'm teaching it, and even where I'm teaching it at times, to meet the needs of my students. Like when I was teaching at a high school once, and we had kids from all over the county coming to our school. And so we had some kids that were living in the inner city, and then we had some kids that were living way out in the country, and they would bus in to come to our school. And I found that, the way I connected with some of my students that had completely different lives than their classmates was not the same way that I would connect with other students, right? Like it required me to have to think about, all right, how do I connect with them? How do I make this relevant to some of my students who might not live out in the country? Whereas, connecting with those students who have unique needs and interests and passions, the way I connect with them is different than some of my students who live in the middle of the city. And so that requires creativity and pivoting and figuring out how do I connect with all of them, which is a tall task. But I found that the more I have the space to be creative, the more I'm allowed to really personalize and make things more relevant, the more I was connect with more of my.
I love the idea of thinking about creativity through that lens of adapting things for student needs, because often when we think about creativity, we think, these amazing lessons and, things, these classroom transformations and all that sort of thing. And then the student needs become a barrier. It's like, I had this amazing creative lesson planned, and now you need this and you want this, and you're interrupting and you're being a distraction from my creative plan. What you're talking about is actually thinking about your students' needs as the outlet for creativity.
Oh, isn't that the truth? And I remember when I started teaching, I had the mindset that like, oh, if I just plan the perfect, big, awesome lesson or unit, I'm going to get every one of my students excited about what we're doing in my classroom.
Yes.
And then I remember I had this one student named Zeke in my class who I'd always had my kids working in groups and doing these dynamic projects, and Zeke just wasn't doing anything. What's wrong with this kid? Why isn't he buying into the program like he's supposed to? And it was just like this for a while. And then finally at parent teacher conferences, I sat down with Zeke's mother And I kind of explained to her about how Zeke just isn't participating and how his group mates complain about him not contributing, and he's very, very little engagement from him. And she said, well, Mr. Muir, can I be honest with you? And I said, please, I need help. And she said, Zeke really doesn't like you. What?
Wow.
Everybody likes my class. Like, what are you talking about? I was like, why is that? And she's like, Zeke is a bit of an introvert, and he gets
Mm.
really intimidated constantly having to work with kids. And Zeke tells me that you're extra. I was like, what does that mean? I was like, and essentially what I learned is that my approach to my students wasn't working for this introvert who needs space, who appreciates quiet, that needs space to recharge and collect his thoughts. By constantly putting him into groups and forcing him to think on the spot and not have any time to process, was not meeting his needs. And so I had to rethink, and I consulted with some mentor teachers, and I learned, like, oh, you know what? I have to creatively adapt my classroom to meet the needs of this student and other students who I found out were also kind of drowning in my extraness. Um, and so what I started doing is creating space in my class for Zeke to have alone time, or even physical space. Like, hey, you don't have to sit in groups all the time. You can actually take what your group is doing, but then go and work on it where you have space to recharge. And we did some other creative things with him. And all of a sudden he started flourishing in the classroom. And it's like, to me, like, that's creativity, right? Like, that's meeting the new needs of my student in a way that wasn't originally planned, but I had to shift and adapt to him. And it had an effect on him. And I think creativity can also be creating really cool lessons and projects, and we can talk about that too. But I think it's also like realizing, oh, there might be a problem, and then figuring out what the solution is.
Mm. That's a great approach because there's always so many problems in
Yeah, of
education.
course. Yep.
So it's endless problems, endless opportunities to be creative.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to roll with that. What inspired you to advocate for creativity in teaching, and how has that transformed your own practice?
Yeah, that's such a good question. One time I was speaking down at a school in Tennessee, and afterwards, and I was talking about a lot of this stuff and how do we design learning units that have the shape of a story, and students are solving real problems, and I was telling stories from my own classrooms about how you could creatively make really cool things happen and get students to engage at a deep level. And so I was talking about that all day long, and a teacher kind of pulled me aside at lunch and said, love everything you're saying. And she's kind of looking over her shoulder to make sure she's not being listened to. She said, but our principal will go and observe our classrooms, and he expects me to be finishing the sentence of the teacher next door when he walks in.
Hmm.
I said, wait, what? And she's like, we're that scripted here, that we are supposed to be so on track with the other teachers on our hallway teaching the same subject that we aren't even allowed to deviate the way we're presenting the content in any way. So I'm not so sure about how what you're talking about in this workshop is relevant. And that was a shock to me. Like, I didn't know what to do with that information. The first school I taught at, where I really learned some of the creative pedagogy that I've always used with students and teachers, I had a principal who was just like, hey, I trust you. I've got your back. Where you falter, I'm going to give you support to help you figure out how to get better and improve. Like, I've got you. And her answer was always yes, or yes, but let's figure this out. But it was always like, yeah, I support really cool things to happen in the classroom. And so I didn't know what to do with that. And it kind of grounded me a little bit, like, oh yeah, I believe in what I'm saying, but there's also this reality, this system that a lot of teachers push up against. I posted on my social media the other day just asking, what's the temperature check in schools right now? How are you doing? How are you feeling about teaching? Just to figure out, what are people all over the place? How are they feeling as we're past the pandemic now, but we're also in the middle of the election and inauguration and all that? How are you doing? And the number one response I got from teachers is, I'm feeling tied down by administration or tied down by the
Hmm.
rules in my school. I'm like, oh, and I hear it all the time, and I'm sure you do too.
Mhm.
Uh, and you want to get mad at admin for that, but you're like, no, but they're playing by the rules that they've been presented with. They're
Right.
following instructions, or they're trying to meet the needs of the states that they live in. They're trying to get
Mhm.
kids into college or help their teachers with evaluations, fill in the blank. I'm like, man, there's so much creativity potential and yet there's such a system sometimes that it's bumping up again. And so, yeah, that's my long way of saying I feel like we need to advocate for more creativity, more personalization, and more freedom for educators to exercise the creativity that they're born with and bring to the classroom.
What did you end up saying to that teacher who said we have to finish each other's sentences basically and totally follow the script? Do you advise teachers to stay in those kinds of situations, or what's your response to that?
I mean, one, I acknowledge it. I think that's part of it is like, yeah, that's difficult. And if I just said to every teacher, hey, if you're dissatisfied with the creative freedom that you're given, just go find another job. That's a pretty privileged thing to say because not everybody has that option. I once worked for a principal who was just so stifling to my creativity. And so I went and taught at a different school where there was a principal. And so I was able to do that. And it worked wonders for my teaching life. It made me thrive and it helped my students of my new school thrive. Like it was good, but that's not realistic for everybody. And so what I'd say is, okay, I hear you, and that is really difficult. I wonder if you can make incremental creative changes to what you're doing. Maybe still follow some of the script, but find ways to deviate it. Or maybe, hey, can you give some type of creativity or activity to reinforce what students learn during the box curriculum? So for instance, we're gonna, and I'm not gonna say this to students, but we're gonna follow this script for the 40 minutes. We're gonna do it. We're gonna learn the content. We're maybe take the formative assessment, but then to really reinforce it, we're gonna do a Kahoot, or we're gonna do this simulation, or we're gonna do something that adds to it. Or I'd recommend, hey, what if you did a project? A main course project, not like a dessert that comes after the learning, but we're going to give you a problem at the beginning of a learning unit. And then while we're learning, while we're doing the quote unquote scripted stuff, we're going to take the knowledge and content that we're learning and we're going to apply it to solving this problem throughout the whole learning. So we're still spending 80, 90% of the time covering the content, but we're applying it in some way to solve some type of issue at the end. Whether that's, hey, we had a refugee come in and she shared how difficult it was moving to America from a developing nation and really struggled with learning new technologies and laws and systems. What if we created tools to help them adapt to life in America? But while we're doing that, we're going to learn about the Industrial Revolution and the different ways people adapted to modernity 200 years ago. And we're going to take that learning and we're going to apply it to creating something to help people in our community. So, and this is an actual project I've done with students. And what's interesting is most of that, and so that's what my students were given that task at the beginning. You're going to solve this problem to serve refugees. And at the end of this unit, we're going to bring in refugees and social workers, and you're going to present whatever it is you create with the hopes that maybe it can serve them in the real world. But while we're creating these tools, we're doing all of this content learning, which is most of class. We're still doing the work of school, but now there's this authentic motivator. There's this relevant problem students are solving. And that takes some time, but not all of the time. But now that's what's driving student motivation. They're working hard to serve people and in the process learning content that they're going to have to learn it. And so now as a teacher, I'm getting to exercise creativity. I'm getting to do something that I might be passionate about. My students are learning to be empathetic and passionate. They're learning to collaborate and critically think for a good reason, but they're also learning content at a deeper level because there's a reason for learning it. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I want to go deeper into this idea of these small incremental changes
Mm-hmm.
because I think there's a lot of power there. Can you speak to what that looks like for teachers who are under different types of creative constraints, not as extreme as having to follow an exact script, but certainly having mandates about what to teach, when to teach it, how to teach it, stick to the pacing guide, et cetera. How can we incorporate more creativity in those situations?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things we can do is have students discuss more and talk to each other. And so, I think part of our creativity can be crafting learning experiences to reinforce what we're learning. And so, let's say the pacing guide is very teacher directed, direct instruction, a lot of lecturing and students listening and maybe personal reflection. What if you added some type of collaborative element? Not something that necessarily, I just described that whole refugee project. Maybe not something that's encompassing a whole month-long project. Maybe it's, hey, instead of the script set, I'll just call it the script. The curriculum says, hey, we're going You're going to present this for 15 minutes. Students are going to do personal reflection, then they take an assessment. What if you presented it for 15 minutes? You do maybe 1 minute of personal reflection, and then the other 4 minutes of reflection time is with other people. And so maybe it's kind of like a think, pair, share. It's because what's happening there, students are having to be more creative. Maybe as the teacher, you're helping facilitate that discussion, which requires your thinking and your creativity. And so all of a sudden, and there's plenty of research that shows when students are discussing, when they're actually sharing information with each other, they're learning it at a deeper level. And so all of a sudden, you're also helping reinforce the content deeper than they would have. And maybe it's breaking the script a little bit, but you're shaking it up. And maybe you're doing a writing unit, and it says, hey, you're going to read this passion and or pass that you're going to read this passage, and then you're going to answer these questions after it. What if you went on ChatGPT and you say, hey, my students are supposed to read this passage. Give me 10 other options that are similar that have the same theme or the same idea. And then it pulls that up and you say, all right, give me links so that I can go and pull up those passages. And maybe that's what you're having students read, to give a little bit more choice and critical thinking on their part about what to read. When you bring up like, how do we incorporate little bits of creativity? I think AI is actually an amazing opportunity to dig deeper.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the past, a teacher might say, listen, I love all this, but where in the world am I going to get time to research and find 10 separate passages that all meet the same needs as the one that my curriculum gave me? How am I going to go and find all that while I'm also grading all my students' work and planning tomorrow's lesson and communicating with parents and doing all the other work that I have to do? It's like, well, actually, now we have this creative assistant where you can go and have it do that work for you. And then you just bought yourself all this time, but then also all of these opportunities for students. And so, yeah, I think that's another tool we can use that's available to us to be more creative. I think you can put into ChatGPT, and I don't know how much your listeners have used ChatGPT, but I know you talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And AI is, you can put a whole unit plan, you can put a whole lesson plan into ChatGPT and say, hey, come up with some type of discussion element that I can add to this. Or I wanna do some fun activity for the final 5 minutes of this lesson. Give me 10 ideas of lesson activities that I could add into this. Hey, here's my whole unit plan. Um, Give me a creative project idea that can be the overriding motivator throughout this whole unit. Oh, I don't like that. Give me 10 other ideas. Like, the AI can do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of a sudden it's like, oh, I can go and convert my lessons and spice it up a little bit. I can feel
Mm-hmm.
more creative. If I've been teaching the same thing for the last 10 years, now I can shake it up and feel a little more excited about what I'm doing because it's new. And maybe this will be what grabs my students. Maybe it doesn't, and I can try something else.
Yeah, I found that ChatGPT and other AI tools are just great brainstorming partners. A lot of people worry about AI, replacing humans or, taking away our creativity, sort of standardize everything's going to sound like a bot. I don't find that to be true at all when I use ChatGPT.
So
It's
true.
exactly like you said. It gives me so many more ideas. Sometimes I'll say like, rephrase this for me. This is the way that I usually explain it. What's an alternative way to explain something? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I never would have thought of that metaphor or that analogy that it comes up with. Like, it really is a great creative partner, and like you said, it's accessible and it's free, so it's just a great go to when you're kind of stuck on how to make something a little bit different and you want to get out of your rut.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and it can be such a tool for students if they know how to use it well. Like one of the things that I've been using it for is, if I'm explaining something to a group of people or if I'm trying to write it in a way that's not being like understood very clearly, you can ask it to create analogies for you. And so you can say, okay, I'm trying to help these students understand what mitosis is. Uh, Create an analogy for how mitosis works that a group of fifth graders might understand or eighth graders would understand, and it'll do that for you. But the creativity comes in is, all right, as a teacher, how am I going to present this to my students in a way that works? Or how can I tie this in a relevant, personalized way that actually inspires my students? You talk to a lot of teachers, and apathy is just rampant in
Mm,
schools all over the place. you know and I don't think it's apathetic teachers. I think it's students who are a product of the culture right now, and
mm.
there's lots of apathy. I think one of the ways that we can shake that up is using the tools and the resources, technology that's available, um, to make it relevant for students. And that's where it excites me that teachers have this opportunity to be more creative because AI can possibly buy them more time to do so.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yes. Can we talk about how this all relates to standardized testing and the amount of class time that is spent on prep for that? How can we incorporate more creativity and approach those kinds of mandated things in ways that are more engaging and more fun for both the teacher and kids?
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, and this is out of most teachers' hands, but I think part of it is that we've got to change what some of these benchmarks are for students. You
Mhm.
know, standardized testing, I was just reading something this morning about how some of the practices that have been dominant in education for the last 20 years, like studying data in order uh, to improve instruction. And this was from the Harvard Business School or Harvard School of Education, did this long study about the effects of studying data to prepare students for standardized tests, how it's by and large been unsuccessful.
I
How,
saw that.
yeah, did you see that?
Yes, it
Yeah,
was amazing. Like, we're getting this data, but then we're not planning interventions based on it. So what good was it? Nothing. It didn't work.
exactly. Well, and so when we're just preparing for a standardized test that eventually is going to be taken junior year of high school, at the very end of the K-12 journey, that's just supposed to inform us how students are going to do when they get to college. It's like we're not even using that data, right? It's not even being used in the way that we should be using it. And so I think we have to shift some of that. But there's also something called reality. And the fact is that is still the largest metrics colleges use to to evaluate if a student should go to their school or not. That's still one of the largest metrics used for teacher evaluations and if a teacher is successful or effective or highly effective or not. And so we still have to meet those needs. I would say that I think strong creativity from the teacher actually leads to better results in the standard.
Mhm.
Right? Like I think when a teacher can meet the needs of their students and create more relevance and more personalization, it leads to better student engagement. It leads to deeper learning and less apathy in the classroom. I saw research not too long ago out of the Minnesota School of or Education. I keep saying business. So the Minnesota School of Education that shows that when students are doing service learning, so the learning that they're doing isn't just about themselves; it's about serving something bigger than themselves. So teachers are creatively finding ways for students to learn content while they're serving someone or something or some place. Kind of like the idea of the refugee project I told you about. When students are doing that, it has a dramatic impact on their behavioral development, on their emotional development, on their social development, their collaborative abilities when they're doing work that matters. But then this research also shows that it has an impact on their cognitive. Students are actually learning more academically when the motivation for hard work is bigger than just grades or being ready for some standardized tests they're going to take in years, right? Like, and which makes sense, right? We're all motivated by doing something bigger than just ourselves. I always ask teachers, has anybody ever been to a staff meeting that could have been? And everybody's like, yes, of course we have. I'm like, okay, when you were in one of those staff meetings that didn't feel very purposeful, that wasn't really important to you, it was just somebody reading bullet points that could have been sent to you in an email. Were you ever tempted to pull out your phone during one of those meetings? Did you ever intentionally sit by your teacher friend so you could have somebody to talk with and goof off with? And everybody's like, yes, of course. I'm like, yeah. Then I ask, all right, have you ever been to a staff meeting that was important? Where there's this big initiative coming up and we all needed to be on the same page, or maybe there's a student issue that we need to have all hands on deck to deal with, or there's a parent struggle, or whatever it is. Has anybody ever been in one of those? And of course, unanimously, people are like, yep, I've been to an important meeting. Like, okay, were you less on your phone? Were you
Mhm.
more attentive? Yeah, I was behavior. Did you when your principal said turn and talk to the people around you? Were you more inclined to talk to the people around you? Were you more social and collaborative? Yes. It's like, yeah, this is what purpose does. Um, but then also you remember the information at a deeper level. And so I'd say with standardization and preparing for students for tests, I think if we can find more creative ways to make learning more meaningful to students and relevant and authentic, it's going to have an impact on the information and content that they're learning in the experience.
I want to pivot a little bit and talk about the role of storytelling in
Mm,
engaging students. This is something that you and I have been discussing on Voxer, and just the power of that in making the learning stick. and creating an experience for students that is memorable for them. I know that's something that you're really big on and something that you advocate a lot for. How can teachers use storytelling to make their lessons more dynamic?
Yeah, I tell you what, like the stuff we remember most from our childhood, from our school experiences are usually stories, right? Like we remember the stories from our lives, and there is just so much neurological research and evidence in human history that we are wired for remembering information presented to us in stories. We remember the parts of our lives that had a real conflict problem that mattered to us, and then the journey of trying to solve that. Right? Like that's what our brains adhere to, that stick to. That's why we still love good stories. That's why we all can remember or sitting on our parents or grandparents or somebody's lap and listening to those stories. That's why you can go to the movie theater and put your phone away for 2.5 hours and not look at it. It's like the only place in society that we can still do that. It's like, yeah, because stories are memorable. And so I've always thought, man, the best learning experiences really are stories that students are a part of. It's giving them a conflict, problem that matters to them, and then helping them figure out, how do I solve that problem? And the real creativity there is figuring out, how do I tie in the content of my class in order to solve that problem? That refugee project was very much a story students were a part of. They were presented with a problem at the beginning when they heard a guest speaker share about the struggle of coming to our city. And then there was the work, there was the rising action of figuring out, all right, what can I do? What do I need to learn? What do I need to create in order to solve this problem? And then there was a climax. It was all building to this moment where they presented their work to an actual group of professionals, and then the denouement, the resolution, is reflecting back on it. It's reinforcing what we learned from the story we were a part of. And that's not new or groundbreaking. That's human, right? Like we all remember the dissecting a frog. That we all remember those creating those dioramas or something, that like, all right, while we're reading the book, we're learning so that we can create something. Um, and so I just think that's a good story that we remember, and I think we can be intentional about designing and creating curriculum that has this shape to it. And that doesn't mean it has to be big and bust down the walls of the classroom in order for it to be authentic. I think authenticity is really about what makes my students tick, what's purposeful to them, and then how can I tie in the content and learning of my class to that creative problem that I'm trying to solve.
How can we encourage students to think creatively and take risks in their learning when so many of them are afraid of failure? There's consequences for failure. They might get left at. They don't want to get a bad grade. How can we encourage and model this for kids?
I think we start by modeling it ourselves. I remember as a kid growing up thinking my teachers weren't completely human, right? Like you'd see them at the grocery store and you'd be like, what are you doing here? And they're like, I'm buying food for a project. It's like, no, to eat. Like, I'm a human. I don't live in my classroom. And I remember just seeing my teachers as like other than everybody else that I knew. And then you start teaching, and then you start getting to know teachers, and you start spending lots of time. And it's like, oh no, they're just as human as the rest of us. And I think it's really difficult sometimes to let students in on the fact. And so I think it starts with vulnerability. I think it's letting students know that you also fail, and you also know how to move forward from failure. And this took a little time, but I learned, like, man, when a lesson just tanks, when I have this activity that I'm like, this is going to be awesome, and then you do it and it just completely tanks, letting students know, like, wow, I thought this was going to go better, right? Like, I thought you guys were going to love this. I guess not. Or when, yeah, I mean, and so just naming it. And think that requires some vulnerability. But I think, as Brene Brown so wisely puts, the vulnerability is the birthplace of creativity.
Hmm.
Right? You can't be creative without being vulnerable first. Anytime you
Mhm.
create something, you're risking that other people aren't going to like it, that it's going to be judged. So I have to be vulnerable to make something. And so I think it starts with that, and letting students know, hey, this is a fail zone. You're allowed to do it in here as long as you're committed to learning from it and keep moving forward. And so I think it starts with naming it. And I know it sounds a little cliche, but it's true. I think sometimes We just have to name it. We have to make students slap the word yet on the end of I can't sentences. Like, I can't speak publicly, or I can't work well in groups, or I'm not good at writing. It's like, no, you're just not good at it yet, right? You don't like working in groups yet. You don't feel comfortable public speaking yet. You need practice. And so I think we have to name it.
Mm-hmm. What would you say to teachers who feel like they are not very creative themselves, that that's not something that they've ever really learned how to draw out of themselves? They don't think of themselves as being creative teachers. They feel like they struggle to come up with new ideas. How can they tap into their creativity and bring that out in their teaching?
I think that starts with redefining what
Hmm.
I think a lot of us think creativity is just about your ability to draw, paint, or create music, or
Right.
come up with wild ideas to tie into my lessons that make students laugh and smile. It's like, yeah, listen, those are all examples of creativity. But also figuring out, how do I deal with this student who's out of control in my classroom while also managing 29 other students? That's creativity, right?
Hmm.
Like learning how to talk a parent down who is just at a level 10 in anger, and helping them understand a new perspective and bringing them down to a level 3. That's creativity, right? Like it comes from the same creative source inside your brain, right? Like that is creativity, figuring out how to how to thrive in your work, even though there are a lot of challenges that you're up against as an educator. That requires creativity. And so I'd say, no, I don't believe that you're not creative. I think that there might just be other ways to exercise this muscle. Um, and I see this all the time is teachers are often afraid of crossing that boundary, or messing up. And I know
Hmm.
this is something that I'm constantly to this day still trying to get better at, is not being afraid of messing up. It's a fear of failure ourselves. And so I think I'd say, hey, take the risk. It's always worth it. And it really is, right? Like it's okay when something fails. It's
Hmm.
not the end of the world. And actually, it feels kind of good sometimes to be humbled and then figure out, what do I need to do next to make this better next time? And so I would say, hey, take the risk. There's something to be said about being brave. I think we'd all agree we want our students to be. We want them to grow up and take risks and be courageous and try difficult things and lead a new path. The Lord knows we need more people leading us in a better direction in our country. It's like we want that in our students. Well, that starts with us sometimes. It starts with
Hmm.
parents at home, and it starts with us in classrooms and in schools, is leading. What does that actually look like?
Hmm.
And so I'd say, be a risk taker. The
Hmm.
consequences usually aren't as bad as you
Hmm.
for
And
failing.
and I feel like you can get more comfortable with it too when you practice outside of the classroom. Maybe
Mm,
use a different ingredient in a meal that you're cooking, or riff off of something, and be like, "Hey, I wonder what happens if I add this ingredient." Do things in small, low stake ways outside of work if that's something that you're not comfortable with, and that also allows you to see how your creativity can enhance it. And I guess I'm thinking about cooking because I think that's a place that inherently lends itself to that, where I'll think, oh, I'm out of this thing. Maybe I can substitute this in and see how it changes the flavor. And that often inspires me to try something new. So it's
I
sort of
love
a
that.
practice outside. And that's something that I talk with teachers a lot about, is how what we do outside of the classroom impacts how we show up in the classroom, and thinking about ways to be creative, practice risk taking outside of the classroom. So it becomes more natural. It's not something we have to force ourselves to do. And it doesn't feel so scary when you do it at work, when that's just something that you inherently do in your personal life as well.
Oh, so good. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's acting. I think sometimes it might be a little fake it till I make it, right?
Hmm.
Like you said, like I've gotten really into cooking this last year. My daughter and I, she's 9 years old, and we have had so much fun this winter in the kitchen, just learning how to cook well together. And it's been such a fun way of stretching ourselves, stretching her, because this is all brand new to her. And I had like 5 recipes I've ever taught. And so I'm like, all right, this stretches you. And sometimes it doesn't turn out good. It doesn't
Yeah.
turn out how you
Yeah.
wanted it to. And we all laugh and throw it out and try again. And then sometimes it does work. And then you're like, oh, we just made this and it's delicious. Like, I can't believe we did this. And you're like, oh, I'm so glad we took the risk. And I think you're right. Like the more you practice this in your everyday life, the more it comes natural to you in your work.
Can you talk about other practices that we can do in our personal lives that help cultivate creativity and help us to think outside of the box, be more innovative, be more willing to take risks?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is how we talk to ourselves.
Mm.
I can really only speak to my experience. It's very easy to get in that negative feedback. Like, oh, you're good at this. Or, oh, you could get better at this. Or there's other people who are better than at this than you. And it's really not helpful. And so I've found that it's a really helpful practice. Try to shut that voice as much as when I'm taking creative risks, when I'm trying something new. It's like that imposter syndrome can be really loud for you sometimes.
Mm.
One of the things I like to do is I create videos for educators and teachers. And usually they're fun, off the cuff videos that, when I have a thought or I have an experience or an idea, I'll just open up my phone and I'll share that and I'll put it out there and whoever wants to watch it can. But every now and then I'm like, oh, wouldn't it be fun if you made like a big, long video that required time and investment and energy and a whole new approach to how you normally create this stuff. And so that's something that I've been doing this last year. And I finally have it. So I've been working with a filmmaker to make this video that I'm so proud of. And I think I've told you before, I am scared to death to put it out. It's still sitting downloaded on my computer right now. And I have not uploaded it and shared it with people, even though I'm proud of it.
Mm.
There's just something about being vulnerable when trying something new that's out of your comfort zone that required time and energy. And it's like, oh, my aunt and uncle are going to see it. And there might be teachers who disagree with the message in it. And what if people don't like it? Or what if I look at the analytics when it's published and nobody and it's like, oh, what if I wasted all this money making it? And so like, yeah, there is this thing like that we have, this fear of failure, which can often inhibit your creativity. But then I think back, I'm like, you know what? When my daughter and I made uh, Thai chicken the other day and it was terrible tasting, it didn't end the world. Like
Mm.
it wasn't the worst thing that ever happened. In fact, it was a really good thing because about it. And it's like, man, maybe, what if that's what most failure is actually like? It doesn't destroy you. It's an opportunity to figure out what do I need to do next. And so I think doing exactly what you said is practicing taking risks and creativity more and more in our regular day-to-day life can actually lend to courage when you're doing some of the bigger things,
Mm.
whether it's creating a video that you're scared to put out into the world, which I'm going to put it out on Wednesday tomorrow. I'm going to do it. But then also whether it's being in the classroom and saying, you know what, guys, normally I would present this to you in a lecture. We're going to circle up and we're going to do a Socratic seminar.
Mm.
And I've never done that before. And I'm not going to lead this. I'm actually going to have you all come up with the discussion questions and the promptings for our discussions. And I'm just going to sit back and watch. It's like, guess what? They might not come up with very good questions, and it might feel like a dud at the end of that lesson. Yep. Well, make some adjustments and try it again tomorrow. Or what if the discussion is awesome and students really dig it, which I've seen it happen a million times in my own classrooms? Then I'm like, oh, well, gosh, it was worth doing something different.
Mhm.
So it's like a muscle. Creativity is a muscle. You got to flex it over and over, and then it just gets stronger and stronger. The less
Yes.
you flex it, the more it atrophies, the less
Yes.
useful it is.
Yeah, and you can try it out in so many different arenas. That's a really cool thing about creativity. It sparks ideas for you to try it out in different ways. And I
Yeah.
love the point that you made about telling kids this is something brand new. I've never done it before. I find that immediately perks their interest. Like, ooh, okay, all right, let's see. Maybe she'll mess up. Like that. It's kind of intriguing to them. Like, she's a little off kilter here.
Mhm.
And then sometimes also I would say things like, I want to try this out with you to see if I should do it with next year's class. So when we're done, I'm going to ask for your feedback and you tell me what you think we should change, what we should keep. What are and also you can do that at the end of a unit too. Like, what were the best parts of this unit? What should I use again? What should I throw out? What should I change? And involving them and giving that feedback, I think helps them get used to getting feedback from you, because now it's a mutual process. It's not just I'm telling you as the teacher how well you did. You actually get to give me feedback, and it's not from a perspective of what you did right or wrong, but more so, what should I keep? How can I make my teaching better? How can I help next year's students? What do you think would be great for them? And approaching that as a creative experience, and experiment with them a little bit, bringing them into that process instead of feeling like I have to have all the answers. I have to have this perfected first, because if it doesn't go well, um, then that's going to be a problem. But if you tell the kids up front, I haven't tried this before, and I want your feedback. I want you to help me get good at this, because I think it could be really cool for our learning. I think this could be really engaging and really meaningful and really help you all understand this concept. So tell me what you think about it afterwards and what else we could do. And inviting kids into that process is really powerful.
Oh, what a great thought. I mean, because then the students are like, oh, I'm not just your underling, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not just here to learn. I'm actually here to serve you as well. And I think it goes back to that same idea of what happens when you're empowered to help
Mm.
others or to be a part of what's going on here. I think so often, at least when I was a kid growing up, right? Like I would sit in a desk and the teacher was the holder of all knowledge and information and power. And you were there to absorb as much as you could so that you could move on to the next level, right? Like that was the primary motivator for me growing up. But then, you become an educator and you realize like, man, my students are so much more bought into what we're doing in the classroom when I involve them,
Mhm.
when I empower them to contribute as well. And that requires creativity. Going back to that again, I think that's creativity. Figuring out how do I get more student buy-in? How do I empower them? But I think there's this fun little thing that you brought up there. It's almost like magic. Like even if I don't, this sounds bad, even if I don't really even need their feedback in that moment, although you do, but even if I'm just asking for their help because I know that they want to contribute, because they
Mhm.
want to feel empowered, um, just by simply saying, hey, what do you guys think I can do next time?
Let's close out with a takeaway truth. I want to hear something that you wish that every teacher understood about teaching creatively, even with restraints.
I'll say this. I think sometimes in the education teacher world, we talk about how it's all about how the students deserve it. And we've got to give them everything we got because it's just about them and it's about their success and their growth. And it's like, oh, I hear you. And I love the sentiment that, yeah, we're putting students forward because why wouldn't we? Education is about their growth. Um, but I also think it's about the teachers, right? Like
Mm.
there's like 5 million in our country. I think in the America alone, like there are a lot of teachers. And I find that the more we can give students opportunities to be creative, do work that matters to them, it actually serves the teacher, right? It's about serving yourself just as much as students. Yes, you're figuring out how to be creative in the classroom to serve them, but you're also doing it because it feels good to be creative. It's human to be creative. You get to go home that night and feel like, wow, I did something hard today. Or wow, I did something new. I'm feeling invigorated. A lot, I can't remember the stat, but I saw it not too long ago how a huge number of teachers leave the profession because they're bored of it,
Mm.
right? Like because they feel stuck in the same spot that they have been for a long, long time. And yeah, the system can be to blame for some of that. But also, I think sometimes we got to shake it up. I think we
Mhm.
got to try new things. Of course, you're bored if you're using the same lesson plans you used 20 years ago. It's like, alter it, adapt it, change it. Use technology that is now available at our fingertips to change it a little bit. And that might invigorate you. And so I just find like, the more I'm creative, the more my students are creative. But then also, the more my students are creative and loving my class, the more it benefits and fills me up. And
Mhm.
that's the same as when I talk with teachers, that's when I talk with students. And I've found that to be true with most teachers I talk to. When their students are into what they're learning, which requires creativity, if you're going to get that kind of buy in, it actually makes teachers feel good about their work.